suppose there was a really good baseball game. So what they should do is they should get other teams to perform that game, just as you get other actors to perform Hamlet. And eventually there will be a really good performance of that game, even better than the actual one. And
I was hired by Stanford in an electrical engineering department, and I was asked if I would develop a course in computer science. And because there were no computer science departments in the United States at that time, I became one of the country's first computer scientists. Okay, and what this did for me is this gave me fantastic opportunities at an early age, which would never have been available to me if I had been in an area like high-energy particle physics. In fact, if I had been in high-energy particle physics, I would still be waiting today for the senior faculty ahead of me to retire so that I could have some opportunities.
We were a little naive in those days about how to sell projects, and we had all kinds of ways that how we would spend our money and design it in certain ways so that its cost performance would be highly optimized. And we would give them to Peoria, and Peoria would say, no, Watson wants the fastest computer. Forget all this business about, trying to make it cost performance, and figure out how to make it the fastest scientific computer out.
What is the difference from a management point of view between the hardware and the software? Why does software seem to be so much harder to manage? And I said, well, I can't answer that on the spot, but I'll think about it. And it took 5 years.
Excellent.
Well, such visions of the future also provoke some scary nightmares. Because if the phone knows where you are and it reports where you are, then the, hi honey, I'm working late at the office, could turn out to be a very awkward piece of information if it comes along with a latitude and longitude that says you're not in the office, you're somewhere else.
Yes. I gave a lecture, and when I finished, one of the young ladies got up in the audience and said, Dr. Kahn, with all due respect, she said, we don't understand how you managed to convince all those governments of the world to let the internet, happen when you were first doing the work. The reason we had a free running room is either nobody cared or didn't think it was important.
So the main ideas here are that computers are ubiquitous. So they better work right. Unfortunately, bugs are rampant. Once I was talking to Dijkstra and about logics and programming languages, and he said they're like ants. Too many of them.
I don't believe I've ever had a machine that was infected by a virus. No, there was one example when I got a memo. It happened to come from the Microsoft HR department.
I do, however, despair of operating systems. I do not myself confidently predict that operating systems will be any better 50 years hence.
My view about the web is it's the great failure of computer systems research. Why did computer systems researchers not invent the web? And I can't tell you the answer. It's because it's too simple. And if I had been there, I would have mucked it up. I swear to God. The idea that you're going to make a new TCP connection for every mouse click on a link? Madness!
And come on up and grab a seat. I'll just, and there were a couple of questions. Of course, those videos will be available on the web. I'm sure that at some future ACM, there's going to be an Academy Awards for the best performances. Just one announcement. All the women at this conference, there's been a request if you would all gather just at the start of the next break, which I think is at 10:30, if you would all gather up here, that they would like to take a photograph of both of you. All of you, sorry, all of you. So I just want to note one of the tweets in the room that the bright side of this, one of the tweets that floated past yesterday was that there were no lines in the women's room. Guys, you wouldn't understand that. But anyway, so onwards. We're opening panel, computer architecture. Dave Patterson is going to lead this, as you all know. Past president of the ACM, is a party professor of computer science over at a small school on the other side of the bay that occasionally plays football with Stanford. The floor is yours.
All right. I'm delighted to lead off the Berkeley morning. As if you've noticed the schedule, all the moderators this morning are from Berkeley. So somehow ACM thinks Berkeley has this reputation of being early rising moderates, as opposed to late sleeping radicals, so, like the rest of the country. So, for those of you in Twitterland, it's really swell to see on the screen what the speaker said 1 minute ago. How about you pose questions so that we can ask them, as opposed to summarizing what was just said? So that would be my request. So if ever the phrase, the speaker is known to all of us and needs no introduction, applied, it applies to this group. So I'm going to keep it short. Now, these happen to all be personal heroes of mine, and I was reflecting that life is pretty good is when you can be friends with your personal heroes. For those of you in Twitterland who don't know who they are, they all have long Wikipedia pages, but I'll give you a short introduction. We're going to take turns speaking for 5 or 10 minutes. The Turing Award winners are going to take turns. We're going to go in Turing Award order with our speakers. The first is Ivan Sutherland, who's now at Portland State. He's widely known as the father of computer graphics. Alan Kay simplified this introduction dramatically by demonstrating Sketchpad, a really astounding system. People 10 and even 20 years later were trying to figure out how he did it. I think he actually invented a time travel machine, went to the future, figured it out, and went back and filed his dissertation. But he started interactive computer graphics. He later contributions to VLSI and asynchronous systems. And I'm going to tell you a little about the personal history. Into this and all the hundreds of papers and impact. He also has 2 children and 4 grandchildren. Ivan.
Dave Patterson seems to have found me out. I'm going to talk this morning about the tyranny of the clock. In Alan Turing's day, logic was expensive. It was slow. But relative to logic, wires were almost free and very fast. Since then, the costs of logic and wires have totally interchanged. Today, logic is fast and almost free relative to logic, but wires are now slow and costly. Wires are costly in 3 ways. 1, the wires in a modern circuit chip cost most of the area. The transistors in a chip hide underneath a thick bed of wires. 2, the wires in a modern circuit cost most of the delay. And 3, worst of all, moving electric charge onto and off the wires wastes most of the energy. The cost of logic and memory dominated Turing's thinking. But today, communication rather than logic should dominate our thinking. Does communication dominate your thinking? My question applies equally well to hardware, software, and theoretical people. Today's digital design paradigm, the clock-to-design paradigm, depends on a rhythmic clock signal. The clock signal breaks time into discrete time steps. The designer knows exactly his intent for all the actions in each time step. The designer can check that all the necessary precursors for the actions of each time step happen in earlier steps. Discrete time steps simplify the design task. But for the clocked paradigm to work, its discrete time steps must begin and end everywhere simultaneously over the design. Because modern chips are too big for a simultaneous clock to reach an entire chip, we now have clock zones. As transistors and wires get smaller, the the area over which one can deliver a clock signal simultaneously also gets smaller. Thus, the number of clock zones increases. The clock beat in one zone differs from the clock of its neighbor in phase and often in frequency. A large chip may have hundreds or even thousands of clock zones. The clock-to-design paradigm works well within each zone, but only within each zone. Between clock zones, the clock design paradigm retards data flow. The clock design paradigm insists on synchronizing all incoming data to the frequency and phase of the clock in the destination zone. Synchronizing data signals to the destination clock requires special precaution against errors. A reliable boundary crossing requires a delay of 2 or 3 clock cycles. It is as if each clock zone posted customs officials at its boundaries. The clock design paradigm exacerbates communication delay. Ever since my 1988 Turing lecture, I've been exploring an alternative clock-free design paradigm. I seek change in the design paradigm to cast off the tyranny of the clock. Instead of making all logic march to an external drumbeat, let us allow each logic element to proceed at its own pace. Because each element acts only when and if necessary, such a paradigm shift will lead to designs that save energy. The clock-free paradigm will also make computers go faster, because doing away with border-crossing delays speeds communication. I see a parallel to the economic efficiency Europe gains by free communication across national boundaries. Casting off the tyranny of the clock offers freedom to optimize separate parts of a design. For example, Rajit Manohar and his students at Cornell report a clock-free, IEEE compliant, double precision, floating point adder with the same throughput as an equivalent clock design. There's an important difference. The Cornell clock-free design uses less than half, about 40%, as much energy per edition as its clocked counterpart. Why? The Cornell design gains simplicity and thus reduces energy by doing the easy cases fast and allowing the rare hard cases simply to take longer. A recent paper from my group at the Asynchronous Research Center at Portland State University reports on faster division by allowing steps that merely shift to go faster than steps that must actually subtract. Casting off the tyranny of the clock offers modularity as well as local optimization. Sam Fuller, who was then the chief engineer of DEC, once told me that his process people could produce faster chips every 6 months. He complained that his product couldn't similarly improve every 6 months because it took 18 months to redesign the entire computer for the new clock speed. The tyranny of the clock made his design insufficiently modular to permit incremental improvement. He chose to march his entire machine to a single drumbeat rather than to allow each part to work at its own best speed. Like all tyranny, the tyranny of the clock stems from the range over which we choose to subject ourselves to the tyrant's authority. Clock-free commercial products are in use today. Handshake Solutions, a computer-aided design company from the Netherlands, was proud of having 700 million of their clock-free chips in use in smart cards, passports, cell phones, and other portable devices. Fulcrum Microsystems, a Caltech spin-off, recently purchased by Intel, sells a self-timed communication switch with outstanding performance. The paradigm shift I seek faces 3 formidable obstacles: technical, social, and courage. First, technical. Make no mistake, designing a clock-free system can face the same hard problems of parallelism that give software people nightmares. But a few pioneers have shown that clock-free design is possible and sometimes even easy. The pioneers have uncovered benefits like using less than half, 40%, of the energy per operation as reported by Cornell. Second, social. All of today's commercial design tools assume clocked design. All engineering schools teach clocked design. Is there any hope that we'll train enough young people in the clock-free paradigm for it to self-perpetuate? Third, courage. Management knows the costs, difficulties, and results of the tried and true clocked design paradigm. Management chooses to bear those ills we have rather than flying to others that we know not of. The clock-free paradigm I promote must eventually prevail. One reason is that it fits physics. Each increase in the relative cost of communication over logic brings us closer to the fundamental physical truth that simultaneous lacks meaning. The clock-free paradigm fits everything we've learned since Turing about programming. Software avoids tyrannous global time constraints. Without freedom from global time constraints, software libraries would be impossible. Modularity and data hiding are basic principles of quality software because they allow reuse and local optimization. Software is self-timed. Each subroutine runs at its own pace. Its users wait for it to finish. Imagine what software would be like if subroutines could start and end only on preset time intervals. My subroutines all start at 368 microsecond intervals. How often do you start yours? Software development proceeds from correctness to performance. After software works, we tune its heavily used parts to achieve the desired performance. Performance almost always depends on only a small part of the whole. Compare this to the situation in a clocked hardware design where each and every signal must arrive on time, even if it's rarely used. The tyranny of the clock wastes both engineering cost at design time and energy at runtime. What a needless waste. Only a small handful of intrepid entrepreneurs and academic researchers have yet dared to explore the clock-free paradigm I promote. I predict that sometime soon, some courageous management will tire of wasting money on the tyranny of the clock and adopt the clock-free design paradigm. Such courage will reap great rewards. I personally shall be disappointed, but not at all surprised, if that courageous management speaks an Oriental language rather than the English, the mother tongue that I share with Alan Turing.
Great. In my role as moderator here, we fast forward 11 years to our next Turing Award winner. In 1999, Fred Brooks Jr. Won the Turing Award for contributions in 3 different fields. And there's an audience participation part, so pay attention here. All right? So it's to operating systems with the OS 360 as kind of redefining computer architecture in the IBM System 360, and on my personal top 5 most influential computer systems ever, it would, the IBM 360 would make that list. For those of you younger, there was a time when not all computers were multiples of 8 bytes, 8 bits, right? In fact, one of the things Fred did was decide that characters are going to be 8 bits to embrace lowercase letters. So. And every computer since then has embraced it as well. And then in software engineering, he wrote this long-lasting classic Mythical Man Month. And here's the audience participation part. How many people here and in Twitterland have read Mythical Man Month? That's what I thought. Yeah, so somebody in Twitterland should report the vote. He personally is my academic role model. He's still teaching at Berkeley. He's been married. Oh, what did I say? Oh, no. It's like he graduated from one of those schools, and okay, I'm flustered here. All right. He married a person who was born in the same city and in the same hospital, but he didn't actually meet her until they were graduate students at Harvard, and he has 3 children and 9 grandchildren. And Fred Brooks, as one of the leading computer architects, is going to analyze Alan Turing's contributions as a computer architect in the slides.
Okay, I'll let you hook it up. Good morning.
Wait, for some reason that didn't work. Just speak. I think if you tap it, though.
Well, let's see. No, let's see if this one works. This one works. All right. One of the things that I especially. I was trying to speak to the one that I'm attached to.
Yeah.
Okay. Whereas Ivan looked forward, I want to look backward, and that's Ivan has always looked forward. And I think it very important to celebrate Turing's very important contributions. But besides celebration, there's such a thing as truth, and I think an important fact about Turing's computer architecture is that it was remarkably uninfluential. And so in looking back, I want to see what lessons we can derive from the fact that it's had so little influence, and see how they would apply to our own efforts in computer science. So let me, as I like to summarize things very briefly, deal first with the highlights of the pilot ace, and second with the peculiarities of the pilot ace, and then ask the question of why has it made so little difference. In 1945, shortly after receiving a copy of von Neumann's extremely influential EDVAC report, the one that Morris Wilks said, I stayed up almost all night reading it, and as soon as I was through, I knew this would be the way computing would go. Well, Turing then undertook to write a report. It took him only 3 months, 80-some pages, and it goes into more engineering detail than von Neumann's did. It's essentially a register-level specification of what became the pilot ace. Because of Turing's cryptographic background, as opposed to von Neumann's essentially scientific computing background, his vision for the machine was much more general purpose. It included the ability, for example, to do logic, and of course, implicit in it was the ability to do language processing. His aim was essentially the same as Seymour Cray's aim and some other designers, and that is to say, how much performance can I get? Although Turing's aim also included how little equipment can I use. Now, for the time, this was important because the hardware is very unreliable, and the less of it you use, the more apt your machine was to run a reasonably free time between errors. And in this he succeeded. So at the time the pilot ace ran, it was about 5 times faster than the other contemporary UK machines, and it used 1/4 the electronic equipment of Wilks EDSOC. It was noteworthy, among other things, in using a 3-address format: source, destination, and next instruction address. And the reason for the next instruction address, for those of you who've ever seen an IBM 650, was essentially the same as in the 650, and that is, if you have a serial memory, And you then can optimize program speed by placing the next instruction, so you have instruction chain rather than instruction vector, or the vector's chain represented. And you can put the next instruction at the place where it will naturally come up after you finish the predecessor one. So there's some good ideas and some important ideas here. Now the machine is very peculiar. Matter of fact, from my aesthetic point of view, it is very dirty. All right. And notice that all of us in engineering feel free to use aesthetic judgments about hardware and software artifacts. We talk about a clean machine, we talk about a dirty machine, and we talk about a clean program or a beautiful program. The assumption of the machine is very important, and that was, as was the case for most things in the 40s, the assumption is that hardware is very dear and very rare. Thank you. New hardware. And that programmers are cheap and abundant. Now, the machine was a beast to program, and let me just touch on a few reasons why. It had no accumulator. It had a set of central registers, but they're not general purpose registers. Some are 2 words long, some are 4 words long, some are 1 word long, and the different registers had different properties as to what they did. The opcode implied in the register addresses, and so if you wanted an addition, you'd wanted a multiplication, you'd use a different register address. There are no explicit opcodes per se. Chained with no instruction.
Well, wait a second. Something's screwed up here. Let's
turn something off.
Let's turn something off. Let's try this one.
Okay. All right.
All right. We're going to stick with this one, okay?
Let me stick with this one a little further away. All right. And there is no...
I'd stay close, eat the mic, and then try that.
There is no straightforward conditional branch. There's a kind of a subtle way to generate a skip by manipulating the registers. So, and something that made no difference to Turing because he could read numbers either way, it's backwards binary. That is, the low order bits are to the left and carries propagate left to right in numbers, and you read the numbers from right to left. Peculiar. Now, why then did Turing's computer architecture efforts, and he kind of abandoned the pilot ace in 1947 and took a sabbatical, went to Cambridge, and then when he got ready to come back in 48, he decided he didn't want to come back, and so he got an offer from Manchester and went to Manchester, where similarly he had very little influence on the very important set of computer developments that happened at Manchester under Williams and Kilburn. Well, I would say the first reason is he wrote this important proposal in 1945, but he never published it. Whereas the von Neumann proposal circulated through the community like lightning and really changed the way everyone in the field thought. Second is the machine was too late. So it was 2.5 years after the Manchester Baby ran, and 1.5 years after Wilkes' first usable stored program computer ran. Well, 1.5 years at the very beginning of a technology and is a lifetime, because all the early adopters proceed, and the people were racing with each other to see who could make a working machine. Why was it 1.5 years late? Well, partly the management dropped it at one point and said this is not worth doing, and then revived it again. But partly Turing went through version after version after version of the specs. And so at one point, Harry Husky came on board for 1 year and tried to build a simplified version and get it going. Turing rejected that, all right. And Husky was working from the 3rd edition of Turing's specifications that had been revised all along. Now, those of us who are in the software business are not totally unfamiliar with the notion that the client changes the objectives and the specs on a regular basis, but we also know that it causes delay. Now, a touchy point is that Turing's personality was picky. As his biographer Hodges says, he insisted on dominating the project, but he didn't let other people collaborate. And so it was solo, and he didn't listen to the other people on the team. And because of this stickiness, if he wasn't there working on it, it didn't proceed. As a matter of fact, nothing really happened until Jim Wilkinson took over as essentially the engineering manager after Turing left to go to Cambridge. Now, Jim Wilkinson is another Turing Award winner for his really pretty work on floating point mathematics. But Jim was also a very congenial guy. I remember watching him put away a whole pitcher of beer in a student hangout in Ann Arbor. And he was an easy person to work with, and he brought the team together and finally made the machine work. Now, I think there are technical factors why the machine was influential. It was a dirty machine. There are social factors why the machine wasn't influential. That is, he didn't publish and he didn't really want to communicate much with people. And there were fundamental factors why the machine was not influential and why his computer architecture worked. And the first is he totally underestimated the importance of programming. He totally underestimated the importance of programming. And we know now today that hardware is cheap and people are dear, and consequently designing operating systems, high-level languages, all kinds of tools. Sure, they take more and more and more memory. So what do? We put on more and more and more memory, but we make machines more and more accessible. And then Morris Wilks is a real hero of mine. And I had a chance a few years ago, to spend several mornings with Morris. And I went back and reread some of his papers from 50 years before, forecasting the development of computing technologies, kind of technology by technology. It's uncanny how accurate his engineering judgment was. You go through each technology and he tells whether he thinks that one's going to be a winner or a loser and why. And it's just amazing to see how accurate his forecasting was. Well, his net summary of Turing was, he didn't like him, but his net summary of technical point of view was, Wilks says, Turing was far from where the mainstream of computing was going to be. And what Wilks understood was where the mainstream was going to be, and what Turing did not understand was where the mainstream was going to be. And it's not clear that he cared, but it is also the reason why his computer architecture work, in contrast with his phenomenal theoretical work and his phenomenal cryptological work, had so little influence. Let me make one remark about the cryptological work. I had a chance as the cleared architect of the Harvest cryptanalytic engine that we built and delivered to the NSA in 1961 to become familiar with the mathematical approach that had developed for dealing with wired wheel machines like the Enigma. It's very pretty mathematics, essentially Bayesian accumulation of logarithms of probabilities, and you just go till you hit a threshold and that says bingo, this sequence that we have tried this time has got one chance in a million of occurring by chance, all right? And so you say, okay, we'll take that one offline and work on it. And then you run another 100 million, a billion sequences, and every now and then you'll get another one that pops up out of the noise. And you, in Harvest, we did this at 4 million bytes a second, and the machine ran for some 15 years in production use, using this mathematics that Turing and Jack Good had developed at GCHQ in the early days of the Enigma. Very pretty work, and not really very much understood. So I think those are the reasons, and I think they're important for us to understand the reasons that would make a difference whether our contributions really will influence the course of things or whether they won't.
All right, thank you. I think I'm afraid of this microphone, so I'll stand over here. Okay, another 10 years forward, 2009, Chuck Thacker, who's now at Microsoft, helped predict the future by inventing it at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. He built the Alto, which would also go on my top 5 most influential computers of all time, that demonstrated the value of personal computing, bitmap displays, a mouse pointer, and Ethernet local area network. And this is in 1975. He met his wife at Berkeley, and they've been married 47 years and have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. And the floor is yours, Chuck.
Thank you, Dave. Well, in preparation for this meeting, I sort of looked back on the timeline of the portion of computing which I've been fortunate to occupy.
Okay, let me just make this a little right.
Okay.
All right, for that.
I didn't know Alan Turing. I never met him. I was 9 years old when he died. However, he did have an almost catastrophic effect on my life, because it turns out that Turing's machine, the Pilot Ace, did have one sort of follow-on. And that was done by Harry Huskey, who took away some of the ideas from the Pilot Ace and built the Bendix G15, which was copied by another company as the LGP30. This was the first machine that I had ever touched. Not the first computer that I ever seen, but the first computer that I ever touched. And it was so difficult to program because of the instruction packing and so on, that I basically gave up in disgust and didn't do any more computing for 5 years. Trying to do physics instead, and I got back into computing because I needed it for the physics. But I eventually wound up at INS after graduation, and so I joined a group with which I have worked for the following 40 years, off and on. I've developed a lot of machines, and I've come to have a fairly deep background in architecture and to some extent in networking. I go back and forth because there are, I was looking at a timeline, sort of a personal view of computing for putting this talk together, and I identified 2 times, T0 and T1, zero origin indexed, of course. T0 was about 1983, and this was, I was then on my 5th computer and my 2nd network, and this was the time when it actually became impossible for a small group or an academic department to build their own computer and have it be competitive with something that they could buy. Until then, we saw a large variety of computers being tried out and experimented with in academia and indeed in industry. But that stopped. And as a result, in my opinion, computer architecture actually became quite incremental and a bit boring, because all you could do if you were an architect is take minor permutations on somebody else's architecture, use standard simulation tools and measure it, and write a paper that roughly had the conclusion of we got between -2 and +20% improvement. And the usual metric, of course, in those days was cost performance. So smaller was better because the components were expensive. And it wasn't until Moore's Law really started getting traction that this changed. So I went off and did some other things for a few years and didn't get back into architecture work until about 2005, which is my T1. And it was actually Dave Patterson that did it, because although I had used them in the past, the field programmable gate arrays had actually snuck up on me in a way that I hadn't quite anticipated, although I should have, because I've actually internalized Moore's Law pretty well over the years. Dave wanted to have a platform for computer architecture experimentation, and came to us looking for support for first an NSF proposal to develop it and then for some people to build it. And it occurred to me that I would like to have some of those things in our laboratory as well. And the problem is, if you get NSF funding or so on for sort of something like that, and it's designed by the university, you don't know how to sell it. So we said, well, what we'll do is we'll design the machine and cause it to be constructed, and then we'll license it at no charge to a third party which can sell it and service it and so on and so forth and support it. And frankly, a lot of people in this community, this RAMP community that Dave had actually brought together, a bit like herding cats, because within a given faculty it's hard enough to coordinate professors, but this was across universities, and Dave managed to pull this together. There were 5. And they all wondered, well, what's the angle? What does Microsoft have to gain in that? And I said, guys, it's enlightened self-interest. We want the things. So that worked out, and it was actually, I think, one of the most successful projects that I have ever done, because it worked the first time. It met every one of its specifications. It met its goals. A startup company was spawned to distribute and service it, and that company has now produced follow-ons to the device and is quite happy and profitable. So that worked out very well. As I was working on the B3, I became excited about the power of FPGAs, and I realized that here was something that would allow people in the architecture community to actually build hardware again, which they hadn't done for 25 years. And so the next thing we did was to actually produce a design for a multi-computer, an actual multiprocessor that could be implemented on a very inexpensive Xilinx development board and used in university coursework. And we built the machine and a tool chain for it, and we give it away. And we've given it away to several universities, and they have run lab courses with it. And it's actually been quite successful. It turns out that for the first time in quite a few years, students have an opportunity to actually get something that they can read the description of right down to the gate level and understand it in a weekend, and then modify it and run various experiments. We don't run operating systems on it, but you can do an awful lot without an operating system in terms of figuring out whether the thing that you're trying to fiddle into existence actually works well. So, in conclusion, I'm actually very up about computer architecture research. I do not think we've maxed out. Of course, Moore's law has not maxed out. The problem is that Dennard scaling, which is the thing that dictates how much power your chip is going to draw for a particular speed, has the second order effects have become first order effects, and it no longer works. So the chips aren't going to get faster, we're just going to get more transistors. And people will wrestle with how to use it, and of course, I'm a firm believer with Ivan that self-timed logic will eventually dominate, because it must. It is the only way to move forward without burning up. So I've been, as I say, I've been very happy throughout my career, and I envy you, just starting out, some of you, and I think the next 50 years will be much, much, much more exciting than the last 50. So thank you very much.
We'll give these microphones another chance here. Picking up on what Chuck said, software couldn't be more popular now in courses. Would you still recommend learning the whole hardware-software stack, or is there still value for understanding hardware, or really just software is where all the action is?
Well, what we found in Microsoft is there are a surprisingly number of people who are programmed day by day and don't actually understand how a computer works, and that limits you. So I think it's important, maybe not to be able to design your own architectures, but at least have a fairly good understanding of what goes on at the bottom. You don't have to, become a proficient machine language programmer. You don't have to become an electrical engineer. But cutting it off at the C compiler seems to me to be quite limiting.
Okay. What do you think Turing would think about cloud computing? Anybody want to take that one? Okay.
Well, I don't think he'd be terribly surprised. He might be surprised at the scale, the level of scale, but he was clearly thinking of very large computers.
All right. We'll step it up one. What about quantum computing? What would Turing think about quantum computing? Other people can answer besides Chuck.
Let somebody else take that.
Take a crack at that. If you can see if your microphone works.
I know so little about quantum computing that
Well, why don't you hand in the... Apparently the mic doesn't work. Just hand.
I know so little about the subject that I don't have an informed opinion, and therefore I'm skeptical.
All right. Okay. Here's a mic. Did you have something?
Fred is from North Carolina, but he's just sounding like he's from Missouri.
What do you think about quantum? Yeah, what do you think about quantum?
I'm definitely from Missouri.
All right. It's pretty hard to pass up a question from a Turing Award winner. So as part of this Berkeley Moderator Morning, my colleague Vannevar Khan has asked for Ivan. In 1957 at the University of Illinois, in case you were confused, the Champaign-Urbana, not the other University of Illinois, David Miller designed asynchronous logic, but it needed too many discrete transistors for completion signals. To be ahead of one's time is usually worse than to be behind. I guess that's the question, is it?
David Muller is famous as the eponym, the Muller C element, which is a wonderful logic gate which has the property that when both its inputs go high, so does its output. And then it waits until both its inputs go low, and then its output goes low as well. I had occasion to give a talk about asynchronous pipelines at the University of Illinois, which David Muller attended. And in that talk, I did what I subsequently learned is called a KLA, a kinetic learning activity. That's a pedagogical term, in case you hadn't noticed. And in this affair, a row of the audience behaves as a row of Muller C elements. And of course, I picked the row in which Muller was. And I said to him, of course, you invented the Muller C element, but have you ever before been a Muller C element? And he had to admit that the answer was no. And I think that the answer about how much logic does it take to do the control in an asynchronous system has changed enormously. It's a challenging design problem, but I think a huge amount has been learned since the early days, and I believe the problem is quite tractable today.
All right, next question is, and I think this will be open for everybody, is how do you think optical circuits, that is light, will affect future computer architecture? You talked about the importance of communication.
Yeah, I think there's good news and bad news. The good news about light is it's pretty hard to modulate. And so it goes where you want it to go, and it gets there without, distractions of any kind. And it goes at a fixed speed. We know how fast it goes. In different media, of course, it goes different speeds, but it goes, moves right along there. And the bad news about light, of course, is pretty hard to modulate. And it's very hard to do logic with light. What you can do mostly is communication, but you have to do the logic electrically, at least so far. And so there's this conversion from electricity to light and from light to electricity. And that seems to be the hard part to do now. There's a lot of work going on in that area, and I think it's promising for communications.
Chuck, I think, has something to say.
Yeah, I have a somewhat different take on it because some of the optical devices that people are beginning to develop, like ring modulators and so on, actually do work. The thing that's really difficult is to put the optical elements right on the chip because silicon and light do not interact very well. But the most recent ideas are to use silicon waveguides on the chip and pump light in from an external laser and use that to go around the chip in various ways. You can take light on and off these paths, and so it seems like there's some maybe better chance than there might otherwise be to make this stuff actually work, although a couple of companies, including Intel, have not broken but at least blunted their picks on this problem.
All right. Next one comes from Tony Hay, and I'm sure this will be embarrassing, whatever the answer is, for me. As what is the lasting legacy of the RISC versus CISC debate? Anybody want to?
Yeah, I think you ought to take it.
I think I need to win an award to answer that question.
I think the RISC has been clearly established as the right way to go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Standing applause. All right. Any further? Why?
Well, I think there are two key concepts, and as I understood it from the beginning, RISC didn't mean a reduced set of instructions. It meant a set of reduced instructions with shorter gate paths, especially through the adder loop, and more elemental instructions so that there's much less complexity in decoding and subsequencing. Now, for ease of use, this depends on having optimizing compilers. And now we have the optimizing compilers. We are yet further removed from actually programming in machine language. And so those old considerations don't matter anymore.
Bob Kahn has a comment.
Oh, great.
So is this mic live? Is this good?
Okay, great. Thanks for taking a question from the audience. Computing capabilities are clearly speeding up dramatically, and if you assume that they continue that way to the point where it's really efficient, essentially, to run emulation systems, do you think we'll get to the point where the natural form of computing in the future is to first download the machine architecture that you want on your emulation machine before you do anything else? And if that's the case, what do you think the architecture of the emulation machine should be?
You know, surprisingly, given that you're 15 feet away, it was hard to understand that question.
Yeah, should we have him repeat it?
I think it was where computers get fast enough that we can emulate the virtual machine that we want. I think you better say it to me without the microphone so they can answer. Or come up and
Go whisper in his ear.
Surprising.
I'll do it up here and hope I get it loud enough for everybody.
It was the echo that was the problem.
Okay.
Yeah. If you stand there, we can hear you.
So my question was, given that computing is getting really fast and assume it will continue to the point where it ought to be fast enough that we can run an emulation system on a computer without worrying too much about any efficiency loss, still be fast enough. Do you think the normal form of computing in the future will be to first download the machine architecture before you run anything else? And if that is the case, what should the architecture of the emulation machine be?
Yeah, great question. I was sure it was going to be good. We just couldn't hear it.
Well, of course, the answer is we do it today. One of the things that we've done as the machines have gotten faster and faster is turn more and more to emulation. And you see this every day when you run a Java program or run a web browser. And what we found is the fact that those languages are not as efficient as bare metal code or C or C++ doesn't really matter, because for the applications that people want to run, the computer is fast enough, even emulating. And of course, as far back as the Alto, we did emulation. The actual virtual machine of the Alto looked nothing like the Alto microprocessor. And that's what everybody did for a long time, use microcode to produce a virtual machine. So I don't think this is a new thing, and I think it will just get easier and easier to do. And what I think we're seeing today is a variety of sort of domain-specific languages that make it easier to program the machine within a specific domain, and you compile down to one of these JVMs or .NET machines or something like that.
In a sense, the whole RISC concept says we are building the engine on which we will do the emulation, and I don't know where you define the difference between emulation, interpretation, and then ultimately translation. So that whole stack seems to me to get fuzzier and fuzzier.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard not to comment. I guess the one comment that I wanted to make was, boy, we sure wish if I got to pick two architects to join this panel who are no longer with us, it sure would have been great to have Maurice Wilkes and John Koch up here. That would have been a really amazing panel. It's just, I have to agree with about Maurice Wilkes. It's amazing his accurate insights at the time. That is one of my favorite quotes is right after he got the first stored program, well, I guess the second stored program computer working, the EDSAT, he's walking downstairs, his program didn't get the right answer, he's sure the hardware is broken, and he really realizes it was a software bug, and that for the rest of his life he was going to be facing software bugs. and the only downside about having John Koch here is I'm not sure anybody else would get any words in. But one of the great minds and inventors of RISC and move compiler technology simultaneously on their fronts. This is here's a question that I think some of us will want to. Are the issues in network architecture more important than processor architecture? So, Chuck, you might have to.
Well, I think they're equally important. Recently, one of the things that I've been doing in my copious free time is to look at networks as they are used inside large data centers. These places have properties that are quite different from the internet as a whole, and we're actually beginning to find that it is possible to engineer networks that are much, much simpler than what we have. And for me, simplicity is still a goal, because simplicity means you can do things like verify the correctness of your system. So we're looking at a network design which, alas, has no software. It's all hardware. And we can write a TLA plus model for it and model check it to verify its correctness. You can't do that with an IP switch. So yes, I think it's very important. And one of the things that I meant to say but forgot to was that I think we've heard a lot in the architecture world about the walls that we're facing. Well, there's one wall that nobody talks about, which is the complexity wall. And the complexity wall is the thing that keeps us from building the kinds of systems that can do the things that we actually want them to do. And I've been arguing for the last couple of years, and I did in my Turing acceptance speech, that one of the things we ought to do is we ought to go back and look at some of the decisions that we made that increased the complexity of our systems vastly and ask the question, in the 21st century, do we still need to do that, or could we stop doing it? It hurts a lot. So, where was I?
Complexity.
Yeah. Well, I think that complexity is fundamentally the enemy. That's the thing we really have to fight about.
I want to branch out sideways. I tell high school students I picked the perfect career for the last half of the 20th century. But if I were picking for the first half of the 21st century, I would plunge into yet more complexity, and that is the interaction between computing and biology. The things that are happening intellectually in biology now are absolutely incredible. And if you want to know where the intellectual excitement of this half century is going to be, it's going to be there, and it's going to depend upon the concepts and tools that computer scientists can bring to it. And so I would say that there's a whole area of complexity that we need to take our simplified tools into this complex application.
For many years, I've had a quote from Tony Hoare on my wall. It says that simplicity is the necessary concomitant of reliability. Unfortunately, some manufacturers think there's too high a price to pay.
I was, in my interesting week, I was just at the architecture conference in Portland on Wednesday and presented Al Vizianis with the Eckert-Mauchly Award, who's one of the founding fathers of fault-tolerant computing. His comment in his acceptance speech is hardware people haven't done enough about dependability. They've left it up to software. And we should start thinking about building systems with no software on it if we're going to make them reliable. What do you think of that idea?
It's a great idea. I mean, what can I say? You want to make the system as simple as possible. Simple means less complex, means less stuff. The stuff can be hard or soft. Less of it is better. If it will do the job that you want it to do.
All right. I think kind of probably the general question that all of us who moderate these panels come up with is advice you would give to people who want to study computer architecture or build computers. Fred, you may have already given yours.
I've spoken.
You've spoken, yeah. And I personally think people talk about what are the centuries? It was chemistry, physics, and this is century biology. But boy, I agree with you. I think biology without information technology is not as interesting as the intersection. And it'll be interesting to see which people get the credit, and we have a lot to offer. But advice for young architects or young computer scientists.
Yes, the advice that I always give people aspiring to computers is don't write a lot of code. Take physics, take more math. That's the fundamental stuff. C programs are not. C is ephemeral. New technologies will come along. You should learn to be adaptable. And math and physics give you that grounding. And unfortunately, computer science does not.
My advice to young people is always follow your heart.
All right. And for those of you who would like more advice from Ivan, Ivan wrote a great paper that was a Sun technical report, I don't know what it is now, called Technology and Courage, which is it's longer than his last statement. But the importance of...
If you type technology and courage into Google, it pops right up.
Pops right up, okay. But that basically, yeah, so let's try that question. When Ken was asked about, why was he successful, he said it was Ken Thompson yesterday. It was sheer luck. That's the only thing that had anything to do with, according to him. He was the right place at the right time. What do you think happened for you?
I've been smart and I've been lucky, and on the whole, I've done lots better being lucky.
Okay.
I've been lucky.
Well, I think luck played a big part of it, but there was also a plot. My basic mode of operation is to always try to work with people who are smarter than I am, and that has paid off in spades.
All right, I like that. All right, I think because we're hardware people and because hardware always shows up on time and really works, we're going to end our session early. So let's thank the speakers.